It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this evening and for tomorrow morning. Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat is a biblical scholar, an activist, and a farmer. She obtained her master's degree from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and her doctorate from Oxford University studying with N.T. Wright. She was the senior member in Biblical Studies and Hermeneutics at the Institute for Christian Studies from 1994 to 2004, before leaving to more deeply ground her academic work in environmental issues. Dr. Keesmaat is the co-author with Brian Walsh of Romans Disarmed, Resisting Empire, Demanding Justice, and Colossians Remixed, Subverting the Empire. She is also the author of Paul and His Story, Reinterpreting the Exodus Tradition, and editor of an Advent book titled The Advent of Justice. She has also authored many academic articles and book chapters, as well as many popular articles too. She is the past co-chair of the Bishop's Committee on Creation Care for the Anglican Diocese of Toronto, and is chair of the Board of Sanctuary Ministries in Toronto. Dr. Keesmaat's current research and writing project is a book on ecological grief and biblical hope, which explores biblical texts that grapple with climate catastrophe in the ancient world. Topics included in this work include the grief of the Creator threaded throughout the biblical story, the grief of the land, and the grief of those who are displaced and dispossessed due to colonization, war, and economic injustice. As a result, themes such as migration, land loss, decolonization, and reparations are also explored, along with what a future of hopeful possibility can look like. The contemporary implications of these realities form a substantial part of the book's argument, and I think we're going to hear some of those things tonight. Dr. Keesmaat founded her online teaching platform, The Bible Remixed, in 2021 to help nurture a community of Jesus followers who are deeply rooted in the biblical story and who are becoming a community of welcome, healing, and nurture for those people and creatures who suffer most from the violence of our world. She offers online courses throughout the year that are open to all on a pay-as-you-can basis. Dr. Keesmaat lives at Russet House Farm, which is an off-grid permaculture farm, and I've heard that she specializes in heirloom seedling tomatoes as well, which is fascinating. Her story is really, really interesting. And that is in the Kawartha Lakes on the traditional territory of the Mishi Sagig Nishnabeg, with her husband, Brian Walsh, and with a very fluctuating number of people and animals. So join me in welcoming Sylvia Keesmaat for this great lecture tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. You can always tell somebody who's been educated at McMaster University because we know how to do an introduction. You know, if you can't say anything else, at least that. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and I've just been having a great week here, teaching and preaching and meeting with people. Most of my teaching is online these days, and so to actually be in a room with live bodies, to have some chit chat before teaching and to have conversations after teaching, that's a wonderful gift. And I'm very grateful to be able to do that here with you now. And I will indeed be giving you some material that is from my forthcoming book on climate grief. So let me begin. How do we cope with our grief? Those of us who wake each day in a world of decline. How do we learn how to grieve, hard pressed as we are to know exactly what it is that we are missing when loss seems to shape so much of our lives? How do we cope with our grief when our grief is woven so intimately with fear and anxiety about the future? How do we cope with our grief when what is at stake is our creational home, the places that we love, the landscapes that have shaped us, the creatures that nourish our wonder? Now, the biblical story is no stranger to wrestling with grief. Through the ups and downs of the narrative, grief weaves its silver thread. The grief of God, mourning the loss of the beautiful creatures. The grief of the animals, the birds and fish, mourning the loss of forest and water, nesting place and nourishment. And the grief of humanity, mourning the loss of the places they loved, the land and creatures that shaped their lives and stories. This talk will delve deeply into one biblical story, the beginning of a biblical thread that not only echoes our own grief, but also provides us unexpected glimmers of possibility that will themselves form a mosaic of hope for healing and newness. But before we delve into that story, we'll briefly explore the terrain of our grief, particularly the grief related to creational destruction, discerning the pathways and streams that have led us into this forest of grief that's so densely constricting our view. So in the midst of wider cultural losses that give rise to grief, and there are many these days, there are 5 reasons I suggest why our current creational crisis is characterized so deeply by grief. And I think sometimes we don't even realize that these things are causing us grief. First of all, we grieve the loss of the places that we love. The fire moves down the mountainside and sweeps through the forest. The river bursts its banks and water flows through the streets of the village. The hurricane smashes homes with trees and tears off roofs so that water cascades not just down the street, but out of broken windows. I wrote this a number of years ago, but it's like every time I look at it, it's like, oh, this just happened again. The bombs drop in the night and the building and the trees collapse. The butterflies stop coming to the flowers and the bumblebee's buzz is silent. Or the housing developments sprout up in the places where hedgerows, pastures, fields, and forests used to be. And sometimes they name those housing developments after what used to be there, right? So after all the birds that used to be there, or the maple forest. Streams are paved over, and the stars, the very stars, are dimmed by our lights. And the places of quiet are saturated with mechanized sound. Between catastrophic devastation and so-called development that keeps the economic engines ticking, the rate of change to those places that nurtured us leaves us disoriented and adrift. For many of us, the first geography that shaped our interactions with the world and rooted us is gone. And so we're untethered. And while for some this is a new grief, for others it is generational. Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, North America, have been grieving the loss of land and lifeways ever since the colonizers began to claim forests and rivers, meadows, and wild rice beds as their own. And for those whose ancestors were forcibly taken from their homelands, shackled and enslaved, generational land loss has framed familial stories and defined identity. Asian, Black, Indigenous, the dominant culture has created the grief of generational land loss for so many in our communities. And for others, the grief of land loss was prompted by war, by lack of food and water, by violence, refugees fleeing to places of safety, places of plenty, longing to return but unable to do so. I've worked with a number of refugees over the years, or I've been friends with a number of refugees over the years, all of whom, when they first come, say, I'm going to go back. And most of whom can't do that. And immigration, too, while chosen, was often rooted in need. And those taken unwillingly, often women and children, thinking of my own mother here, long for their home while they're in a new land. This is the grief we feel over the loss of the places we love. So that's the first one. Secondly, we grieve the loss of a future we had hoped for. Because we're creatures who think ahead, right? Sometimes with anticipation, sometimes with dread. So what happens when we see little scope for hopeful anticipation? When thinking of the future doesn't bring visions of a safe house or land that's producing abundantly, or enough food on the table, or children and grandchildren who are safe and healthy and able to grow into their gifts in the world. I mean, we had all hoped that the future would be a place where our communities could flourish, where healing might come, where justice might finally result in peace. But a future of increasing loss of habitat and loss of biodiversity and the loss of affordable food and bearable temperatures weds us to anxiety about the future. And so we grieve the loss of the future we had hoped for. I mean, I think I'm not alone in looking at my grandchild and thinking, I don't even want to think about the world that you're going to grow up in. We grieve, thirdly, the loss of our connection with creation. I mean, tightly bound to our grief over the future are fears over our relationship to creation. And I think this is one that we're not aware of often. I mean, it used to be that those who did not have access to outdoor spaces, to the nourishing embrace of trees and the wild freedom of rivers and lakes, or the encouraging sound of birdsong, were those confined to urban centers, those without access to the joy that resulted from being surrounded by the natural world. But many people in our culture are disconnected from creation due to the requirements of their work. I teach online now, so I'm one of them. The character of their education, and increasingly by choice. I mean, even those who live near me in a rural area where there are a lot of lakes and woods make choices that cut themselves off from the natural world. And so that means not only do we interact less with our human neighbors, we also interact less with our non-human neighbors, with the trees and plants and animals and insects and the rocks and mosses and birds and snakes and frogs that live in our neighborhoods. When the Oxford English Dictionary sort of cuts words out of their dictionary, you know, and out of their children's dictionaries, they've been taking out words that relate to the natural world now, words that label plants and trees and animals because they're not relevant anymore. Oh my goodness, this is scary. These connections are meant to nourish us. We were meant to have a lifelong engagement with a beautiful and strange otherness. The ways of other creatures were integral to the shaping of our souls. So what happens when this deep interaction with the wild other is lost to us? When our bodies are no longer shaped by the cold of the wind or the need to tread slowly and softly or run swiftly? When we no longer encounter with breathtaking awe the red-belted bumblebee next to the well, or the northern water thrush shyly bobbing on the edge of the pond, we carry the grief of that loss deep within our being, and we grieve that loss of our connection to creation, sometimes without even knowing it. And fourthly, we grieve our complicity in these losses. All of these griefs are intensified when we ponder our own role in creation's demise. We carry guilt and remorse for the choices we have made that have threatened ecosystems, that have caused death. We lament the dreams that we had for our place in creation and the way we abandoned those dreams. And we grieve, because this isn't all a choice, right? We grieve our entanglement in the systems and structures that shape our culture, the economic and political and social dynamics that, face it, we have so little control over and which force us, sometimes unwillingly, onto paths of injustice and oppression and death. Such powerlessness can only give rise to deep lament and deep grief. And fifth, we lament because we grieve because we're drawn into the sorrow of creation. All of these griefs culminate in sorrow over the suffering of creation. I mean, even if we're not aware of it, we are so intimately connected to the earth, the trees and the plants and animals that nourish and sustain us, that the sorrow of the forests and the ash trees. I went for a walk in the woods this afternoon and saw it. The emerald ash borer has been at work here as well. The wolves, the lakes, and the eroded earth itself, that sorrow shapes and surrounds us. Francis Weller, in his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, suggests that the sorrow of creation is weeping through us. So what's the appropriate response when we're faced with destruction and violence and death on such a large scale? Well, Weller says it's essential that we stop and recognize these losses. It's good manners to respond with sorrow, outrage, and apology at places that are shaped by so much loss. Just like we stop and respond with sorrow when we read the news about what's going on in Ukraine or Gaza or the Sudan. That is, we're moved to compassion for our creaturely neighbors, the land, the rocks, and the forest. And in so doing, in being moved to compassion, we bear the griefs of the earth and carry its sorrow. Now, these griefs are not unique to our time and our place. They aren't even unique to humanity. At the outset of the flood narrative, which is what I'll be focusing on tonight, there is a short statement that's breathtaking in its simplicity. The Lord saw that the evil of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was evil continually. And the Lord regretted making humanity on the earth and was heartsick with grief. The delight of the creation story in Genesis 1 has not been realized. The exclamations of joy that are woven through Genesis 1, that tov, 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 good, 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 this is great, that evident and ongoing excitement in the rich diversity of sounds and sights and smells has now turned to grief, regret, and sorrow. The Creator had hoped to live in a food forest, some of you have heard me say this already, on a river with a beautiful and rich diversity of plants, animals, insects, water creatures, birds, and a couple of naked vegetarians. That's what God wanted to do, live with all this wonderful diversity. But instead, that first couple engaged in a radical culinary indiscretion. It's my husband Brian's phrase for it. By eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They saw and they took. They took what they wanted and they ate. And the Creator's hopes for a future in a harmonious and beautiful creation with all of the beautiful creatures was dashed. The first human couple took what they wanted, and that Hebrew word for took is echoed in the prelude to the flood story in Genesis 6, verse 2, where the men are described as those who took whichever women, and as many women, as they wanted. The overtones of male violence are clear. Men taking women as possessions, as many as they wanted. It's no wonder that the children from such violent family systems became the heroes of old and the warriors of renown, as they are described in verse 4 of Genesis 6. Now, for those raised on stories of male saviors, phrases like heroes and warriors are thrilling, evoking knights and battles and honor and bravery and daring deeds and quest for valor. Think of the Arthurian legends, right? But let's not be deceived by romantic language here. For the vast majority of people throughout history, heroes and warriors are the ones who destroy families, rape women, capture and enslave innocent people, and pressure the powerless into armed warfare. They are the ones whose legacy is fear and heartbreak, not harmony and flourishing. And it's clear that for the Creator, these heroes and warriors are the problem. Their presence meant that, and this is the very next verse, the Lord saw that the injustices of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of their hearts was only evil all day long. It all piles on there. Every inclination of their hearts was only evil all day long. I mean, a Calvinist could not have written that better. I say that as somebody who was out of the Calvinist tradition. It's no coincidence that the warlords whose currency was violence and power created violence on the earth. The linking of war, violence, and creational destruction has been a constant throughout history. And such violence on the earth is described a few verses later this way: the earth was ruined in front of God's very face and was being filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was ruined, For the way of all flesh the way all flesh was living ruined the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is imminent, for all flesh has created violence in all the earth, and I'm going to ruin them along with the earth. Imagine it. This wonderful diversity and world of diversity and richness has been gutted. The abundance of creation has become scarcity. The creatures who lived in the trees are now homeless. The streams are polluted. The earth is no longer fertile. Now, oddly enough, this sense of destruction has been blunted by the common translation. God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. Ruined is a better translation. And the repetition makes clear the dynamic of the flood. The earth has already been ruined. And as a result, the Creator will extend that ruin to those who have destroyed the earth in the first place. We could also say that the earth had been destroyed, and so God will destroy them. The flood then is both caused by climate catastrophe and a response to climate catastrophe. Ruin leads to ruin, destruction to destruction. The flood is indeed a judgment, but it unfolds out of the situation that the people are already in. The Creator doesn't impose judgment, but rather lets it unfold out of the consequences of disobedience. And that happens throughout the Hebrew Bible. So remember the care that the Creator had taken in calling forth this wonderful interconnected world where there would be a home for every creature, a home for the earth creature, humanity, and a home for God's very self. Now the Creator's heart is full of sorrow. The world that had so beautifully sprung to life was full of violence. And in the midst of this, the Creator agonizes over restoration. How could healing come again? How could the toxic waters be cleansed, the barren landscapes reforested? How could the salmon return to the rivers or the wild rice to the lakes? Could cleansing bring restoration? Would destroying those who enact violence on the earth, would that bring healing? Could the ruin and violence simply be washed away so that creation could begin anew? And how then would newness come? Well, perhaps the family of Noah, wife, sons, and their wives, could be the new image bearers, the ones who would observe and serve creation during the judgment of the waters, so that they would know how to live in harmony with other creatures when it's time to start anew. And Genesis 9 does read like a new creation narrative with its echoes of Genesis chapter 1. So this was a plan of judgment, yes, but also a plan to birth newness out of destruction. And so the waters cover the earth, and all life that did not enter the ark is destroyed. Isn't it amazing we tell this story in Sunday school? It is a devastating story. Now, we don't know what the Creator experienced as all of creation was wiped out. Was there a point when the Creator realized that the destruction was too much to bear? If the Creator was already grieved, we've already read that God's heart was grieved. If Creator was already grieved over the violence done to the earth, was there a point when the Creator also entered into overwhelming grief for the end of the vibrant, colorful, chattering, singing, aromatic richness of the earth? Was this why the Creator made a promise to refrain from such destruction again in Genesis 8:21? And these verses are so interesting because nothing has changed, right? God said in God's heart, I will never again curse the earth because of the earth creature, the Adamah, because of the Adam. Even though the inclination of the heart of the earth creature is evil from youth. I'm using earth creature there for humanity because the word Adam literally means earth creature. That has come from Adamah, the earth. So even though the inclination of the heart of the human creature is evil from youth, or the earth creature is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done, as long as the earth endures. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The inclination of the human heart has not changed. It's as evil as it ever was before the catastrophic destruction of the flood. So why does the Creator promise to never engage in this kind of destruction again? I wonder if the promise of never again rose out of anguished grief. We don't know, but we do know this. For the Creator, the grief of the violence done to the earth was not healed with earth's destruction. We know this because we see the Creator's continued lament over the destruction of the earth throughout the prophets. Hosea 4, Jeremiah 4 and 9 and 12. We see God's grief again and again throughout the text. And we also know this because the Creator's very spirit is groaning with the sorrow of the earth, as Paul tells us in Romans 8:26. And we also know this, that in spite of such grief, the Creator promised in the flood story that from now on, even in the midst of violence, the flourishing of the creatures, the flourishing of creation will be where God's best efforts are directed. For God makes a covenant in Genesis 9, not just with the people who had survived the ark, but also with every living thing, along with the earth itself, to never again destroy every living thing with the waters of a flood. And let me say this again, because the text actually says it over and over. This is a covenant made not just with human beings, but with all the creatures on the earth, the winged creatures, the crawling creatures, the six-legged, the four-legged, the plants with fruit and the plants with seeds. The Creator establishes a covenant relationship with them all. When I first discovered this text, I was astounded because, as I mentioned, I was raised in a Calvinist context. And that first covenant with Abraham, that was talked about as being, the most important covenant. So imagine years on discovering God's first covenant with his humanity and all of the earth. The rocks and the riverbeds, the streams and the mountains, all brought into covenantal relationship with the Creator. And just to root the point even deeper, the word covenant in relation to the earth and all living things is repeated 7 times in Genesis 9, 8-17, which, as you know, is that full and complete number in the biblical story. So I think it's fair to say with this promise, God commits to creation completely, unconditionally, forever. And let's be clear, this is a promise that's going to cause the Creator continued grief. God has no illusions about being in this relationship. God knows how bad it can get. For the Creator knows that human beings have an inability to control their appetites, which I think is why constraints are put on the eating of meat in Genesis 9. And the Creator knows that these appetites will lead to species extinction and erosion and drought and unjust land grabs, all of which are depicted in the prophetic literature. And the Creator knows that human beings have an addiction to violence, and that such violence will lead to land loss and displacement, genocide, and the ruin of homelands. But even so, the Creator makes this commitment, commits to suffering in this relationship and to practicing restraint in the face of that suffering for the sake of the life of creation. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Terence Fretheim might recognize his influence on me here. But the Creator so deeply wants a home for all creatures, for the earth, for God's very self, that God is willing to hope that a new future might be possible for all in relationship together. And this new relationship is symbolized by the Creator hanging a rainbow in the sky, a reminder to God, not to us actually, but to God, that the relationship has shifted. And the word for bow in Hebrew, as in English, denoted a weapon, the bow that an arrow flies from. God is hanging up this weapon in the sky. Weapons of destruction are hung up for good, no longer to be used. And so God commits to refusing to act in the very ways that God was condemning. The warriors of old relied on the bow in their spread of violence that ruined the earth. In hanging up the bow, God commits to never ruin the earth again. Violence is never the answer to violence. I know Richard has a different interpretation of this, but Maybe he'll argue that later. Now, there are two threads of grace and hope that weave their way through this narrative. The first is easy to miss if one is reading the text in translation, which many of us are. Noah's name literally means rest, linking Noah's name back to the seventh day of creation, when God rested and took delight in creation. So for ancient hearers of this story, Noah's very name promises a future of hope, of possible delight in creation once again. And such hope is rooted in God's plan for the continuation of life and the faith that Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives have in it. They listen to what God has told them to do and carry it out, no matter how impossible and improbable the plan seems. Now, I'm a farmer, and I can tell you that just two of any creature is not a sufficient genetic pool to start a viable continuation of life. Those of you who know biology know that as well. So it's an impossible seeming and improbable plan. Noah was a farmer. He would have known this too. But as the story goes, they obeyed God. I'll come back to that. The second thread of hope that weaves its way through the text happens on the ark during the flood itself, as Noah and his wife and his family end up having a crash course in their calling as the ones who were to serve and observe the earth, the calling of the earth creatures in Genesis 2:15. Let's not forget that those in the ark knew the story of violence and ruin well. For the family of Noah, were living a grief experienced in our own time by indigenous peoples, by those in war-torn lands, by those forced to flee the places they love. They had seen how the warlords enslaved the people in their land. They had seen how the land, severed from the care and affection of those who cared for it, was abused, how the trees were cut down for palisades and forests, how whole forests were chopped and burned to heat the metal for weapons. I mean, this begins by talking about warriors, right? They need weapons. How the earth untethered from the trees washed away and muddied the waterways. How the mines turned the waters to poison. How without trees, fertility decreased, animals were scarce, the soil dried up. This is how the earth is ruined. So perhaps when God announced the ruin of all flesh as the penalty for the ways that the earth had already been ruined, perhaps the men and women in Noah's family breathed a sigh of relief. It'd be similar to, stopping the oil sands in Alberta, where Canada is destroying ecosystems for the sake of dirty oil. But then the rain began to fall, covering the ruined land. Was it then that grief and longing entered their minds? Did they remember when the meadows had been alive with butterflies and bees? Did they remember waking to the thrilling choir of birdsong and falling into dreams held by the choruses of frogs and crickets? Did they remember the rich earthy smell that surrounded them after a rainstorm, the scent of the cedars as they walked in the forests, the heady perfume of the almond and apricot blossoms as they planted their seeds? All the fullness of sight and sound and scent lovingly remembered, creating a longing, a deep sorrow for what was now lost. And I suspect that many of these losses were not new. Given God's sorrow over creational destruction, this had probably been the unspoken sorrow of the people on the ark before they entered the ark. But these sorrows had now been joined by the losses brought by the flood waters, the loss of family, the loss of the cousins they had played with in the forest, the loss of neighbors who had helped the women give birth. The tapestry of community and kinship that had held them was now drowned in the waters of the flood. How does one bear the loss of home? How does one carry the end of the world? How did they stay afloat in this flood of sorrow? And in the midst of their grief and their sorrow, their deep longing for the places and peoples they had lost, they knew that being rooted in the earth meant caring for the creatures of the earth. In the midst of their own pain, they immersed themselves in the task at hand. I mean, here they were united in feeding the hungry and binding up the broken creatures, cleaning out the spaces that had become home for the winged ones and the four-legged ones, seeking the lost and escaped, I imagine, before they were devoured by other creatures. My one constant experience as a farmer is that they will escape. In this place, all were vulnerable, all needed to be served. And could it be that gradually their sorrow was pierced by moments of joy? I mean, death lay outside their walls, but birth soon began inside. Shrill open mouths, small furry bodies, knock-kneed creatures stumbling for an udder, life exploding all around. And with birth came knowledge. This is what each creature needs. This is what happens in the secret places of the forest, the edges of the meadows, the tops of the trees. This is what we lose when the forest disappears and the hedgerows are cut down. It was a close-up view of everything that normally happened out of sight. And each day their grief was held in acts of service and hope, in the deep daily rhythm of ensuring that life continued. They were fulfilling that ancient call of Genesis 2 to serve and observe creation, being called back to their true role as earth creatures and as image bearers. So this ark then was not only a place of safety and nurture that would make resurrection possible, the ark was also the place of learning who they were really called to be, Adam, earth creature. Now, even if this is a story of hope, how does it apply to our situation? I mean, this is an ancient story in an ancient text, and our problems are different, aren't they? I mean, it's become increasingly and depressingly common for writers to naively assert that biblical writers had nothing like our current climate catastrophe in mind as they were formulating their texts. But I suggest that the story of the flood has significant similarities to our current context. And it's not the only one that does, but it's the one I'm focusing on tonight. I could be talking about Jeremiah and the exile. I could be talking about the first century, the time of Jesus and the writing of Paul's. I could be talking about the book of Revelation, if you want to talk about contemporary parallels. So there's a lot. This is a story that arose out of the grief over the violence done to the earth by a culture that valued powerful men who were oppressive towards women and committed violence against them and the earth. This is not new to us. This was a culture that valorized warlords and conquerors, a culture that privileged war over peace. It was, in short, a culture very like our own, where domination, oppression, and military might are powerful contributing forces for environmental degradation. And it's also a story about the possibility of complete environmental devastation, one that will irrevocably reshape life on Earth, also the sort of catastrophe we face today. It's also a story of deep loss faced by the family on the ark, the story of so many families today. For so many in our world, the land has been ruined by agriculture, by colonization, by war, by industrialization. And this loss is the often unspoken sorrow of our times. I remember being at a horticultural society meeting in my very small town of 1,500 people, and a speaker came in and started talking about climate catastrophe and how this was going to shape, he was a naturalist, how this was going to shape all the plants and animals in our area. And I'm looking around at these people thinking, oh my goodness, I talk about this in my classes, but I don't talk about it with these folks. How are they going to respond? It was like somebody had lifted the lid off a seething pot at the end of the evening. They were all carrying around incredible grief and sorrow over what was happening and never had a chance to talk about it. And this guy had given them a context, given them permission. It was beautiful to see and deeply saddening because it made me realize so many people are walking around with this unspoken sorrow. Everything that tethered us to our homes and all the sights and sounds and tastes, All the relationships that held us safe are already or soon to be lost. So this is, in short, a familiar story, which raises the question, how does it provide hope for us in our current context? Well, I think we take a clue from the fact that the place of resurrection in this story was the ark, that this place of hope was a family that chose to be faithful to God's commandment to create a safe home for other creatures, quite literally, to weather the storm, even though that faithfulness came at great personal cost to themselves. This is a family that learned the restorative joy of being apprenticed to creation. So what if we ourselves were to take that first calling quite literally, as Noah, the women, and their husbands did? What if at a basic level, we were to look around at our watershed, our places, and ask what it would look like to create those places where biodiversity can flourish, those places where in the face of impending heat waves and drought and flooding and fire, some species might be able to still flourish. I mean, the implications of this would be far-reaching. In the first place, this would mean, like those in the ark, becoming apprentices to our place, going back to our calling as Adam, earth creatures, and paying attention, observing the watershed where we find ourselves, urban, suburban, or rural, and doing the careful, attentive work of figuring out what creatures live there now, what used to live there, and what we can do to ensure that they can flourish there once again. And a significant movement has already begun at a grassroots level for people to begin this work in their personal lives. In Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation. In the US, Douglas Tallamy's been writing about this in his book. I see some people nodding, Nature's Best Hope. I highly recommend his work. From pollinator gardens in city lots, to replacing front lawns with plants, to interplanting vegetables with flowers for pollination in garden plots, people are realizing the importance of providing habitat for our insects and birds. And this alone means that urban centers are now becoming the places where insects are better able to thrive than in rural areas. Toronto has a larger diversity of pollinators than some of the surrounding farmland, because that's all monocropped, right? There's no hedgerows, there's nowhere for those pollinators to live. Such actions, however, tend to be scattered and personal. So what if we worked not just in our small spaces, but mobilized for a vision where our whole city was an ark? And there are larger cities around the world doing this. They're beginning to ask what it might look like to mitigate the coming destruction for insects and animals, and also for people. And I don't have time to go into detail here, but I'll mention Medellin in Colombia. And if you Google Medellin green climate mitigation, you'll get information. Singapore is becoming a green city with all those skyscrapers. And here in the US, Tucson, Arizona. If you Google Brat Lancaster, Tucson, Arizona, he's greening this whole city. These examples demonstrate that it is possible to create places that can provide mitigation in the face of increasing heat, increasing drought, and loss of biodiversity as climate collapses. So one of the courses the Noah story calls us to, therefore, is to look at our own communities, our own watersheds, and imagine what restoration and mitigation could look like there. But of course, there's more to this story than the flood and the ark, isn't there? There's also the context of the narrative, the link between violence and the destruction of the earth, the death of the warriors of old that the warriors of old create in their wake. And this link is easily seen in the destruction of land that war and violence create, from the damage to creation from bombing and shelling, to the deliberate destruction of olive groves, water sources, greenhouses, fields, and trees by enemy forces, most stunningly right now in Gaza, but also in the Sudan, Lebanon, the Ukraine. The evidence is everywhere. And connected to this is the violence necessary to create the weapons of war, right? The violence to the earth and her creatures in the oil fields and the fracking sites and in mountaintop removal. Doing violence to creation is necessary to fuel war. Doing violence to creation is necessary to fashion weapons, along with the violence done to creation that is the result of war. There's violence from start to finish. And anybody who takes seriously the grief of Creator God over the destruction of creation, anybody who takes that seriously needs to be working for peace. That is the utmost importance. Peacemaking is an environmental issue, as is the necessity of reducing the need for violently removing oil and gas from the earth to fuel the rest of our lives, right? Not just that violence, but our whole lifestyle. And while the move to electric vehicles and the move to heat pumps alongside furnaces, which has really taken off in Canada, as well as the move to solar and wind, are creating a society-wide shift away from the violence of war and oil and gas, they carry their own violence in the need to destroy ecosystems as different metals and resources are mined for batteries and parts. I live off grid in a solar powered house, and we have these batteries in the basement, and they're an environmental disaster. It would be much better actually if we could be hooked into the grid with our solar panels. We're a little too far out for that, but we need to turn all of our cunning and all of our imagination to rethinking and reshaping all of the assumptions of consumption that underpin our society. Swapping out one form of consumption for another isn't quite going to do the trick. Now, a lot more could be said about this, but I'm going to stop that bit there. And let me conclude by situating ourselves in this story. There are many ways that this story, with its violent men and ruined earth, is our story. Our imaginations, too, have been captured by extraction and the lifestyle it fuels. But this story was told as much for us as for our ancestors, to shape our imagination in the midst of our grief. This story is meant to open our eyes, to enable us to imagine apprenticing ourselves to the insects and the animals, the birds, the swimmers, the rocks, the rivers, the mountains, the flowers and the trees of our places. This story enables us to imagine what we might learn about the needs of other creatures so that we might listen to their stories of flourishing and of sorrow. But that's not all. If we take seriously the grief of the Creator God over the destruction of creation, this story also invites us to imagine what it might look like to bear the image of a Creator who calls us to peacemaking. Peacemaking calls us to imagine how we might end the violence. It calls us to be a people of rest, to refuse the endless taking that fuels this violence to the earth, but rather to hang up our weapons like the God we worship. So this ancient story of flood and covenant is inviting us really to enter into the story. It's a story of grief, yes, but it's also a story of transformed imagination, of observing and serving, of peacemaking, and of a commitment to new life, all held within the grieving arms of the Creator. Thank you. I think we have, I have no idea how long that took. There's no clock. I'm still living in a different world where there were clocks on walls. We have time for some questions, I believe, if there are any, or comments or challenges. I'm always up for an argument too. I was raised Calvinist, remember.
You mentioned watersheds. Can you explain the importance or what you mean by talking about cities and watersheds and working in that area?
Sure, yeah. So essentially your watershed is the main bodies of water where your water comes from, and even where your wastes go if they're not carefully stewarded so that they don't end up in the water. Your watershed is the body of water that provides life for all the growing things in the area where you live. So There are micro watersheds and larger watersheds. You're part of the Great Lakes watershed because of your proximity to Lake Ontario, as am I. I'm just close to it on the other side of the lake. But then there are smaller watersheds as well. My immediate watershed is the Martin Creek watershed, which is the marsh near where I live. The health of your watershed determines the health of the water that you drink, the health of the creatures that live in that watershed. And so paying attention to your watershed is a way of thinking where you situate yourself in the land that isn't dependent upon sort of map making, right? The way we have mapped, the way the colonizers mapped the places where we are, which is often pays no attention to the natural geographic features or even to watersheds, right? I mean, the fact that we're all part of the same watershed in terms of Lake Ontario, but we live in different countries, that's an imposition on the landscape, right? We all should have an equally should be equally invested in the health of Lake Ontario because of where we live and the watershed around it, the whole Great Lakes ecosystem, really. But because we live in different countries, radically different things happen to that watershed. And that's a false breaking apart of the watershed. You'll find that Indigenous peoples almost always were defined by the watersheds that they were a part of, which is why there are so many different Indigenous peoples on the West Coast. Like if you go down to sort of California, you've got all these ravine watersheds running down to the ocean, and there were different peoples in each different watershed there. So does that answer kind of your question? Our cities often have buried our watersheds too, right? Our streams and rivers.
Yeah, but many other people. Thank you so much, Sylvia. It was wonderful, at least to me, and I think it was a powerful reading of the story of the flood as a paradigm for us today.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you can say more about that connection with taking
Mhm.
in Genesis 3
Mhm.
and 9, especially as the text is even more potent, I think, because it says that the sons of God
Mhm.
saw that
Yeah.
the daughters of human beings were tov, beautiful, and they took.
Mhm.
So I wonder if there is more that you would like to say about
Yeah, I mean,
that.
the parallel is very strong there with Eve sort of seeing that the fruit of the tree was beautiful. She saw it and took it. And you have that exact parallel in the Genesis 6 passage as well. They saw it and they took it. And there's, I'm trying to remember the scholar where I first read this actually. That scholar drew another parallel with another text in the Hebrew Bible, but I can't remember what that text was right now. I kind of had to shorten things a bit for this, but yeah, it's a very potent parallel. Now, I'm not a Hebrew Bible scholar, so I don't know of a textual tradition there, if it's the same textual tradition in terms of JDP, if people still use that between Genesis 3 and Genesis 6. But certainly in the text as we currently have it, those echoes are there that suggest the, that act that brought on the curse in Genesis 3 is linked to this taking in Genesis chapter 6 as well.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. It's really encouraging to hear. Very thoughtful process on that passage and this topic. So, as I've gotten closer to this topic in particular, I've realized that the direction that my hopefulness is guided towards is much closer to Eden as a holistic ecosystem in my mind, something that's very well functioning,
Mhm.
as opposed to the eschatological hope that's in the Bible, which is described in metropolitan terms.
Mhm.
And so there's this, cultural progression of something good that's being built. Can you
Mhm.
talk about how to have a metropolitan hope when I don't really want one?
I understand entirely what you're talking about, having lived in Toronto for 13 years and then moved out. Yeah, actually, this touches upon a webinar I did earlier today. So, yeah, I think so. First of all, what we do have in Genesis 1 and 2 is this. If we read them together, you do get this vision of this incredibly diverse food forest, right? That there were, more a food forest than a garden, something more like North America was, or Turtle Island was before contact, before the colonizers made contact, right? A carefully stewarded food forest that the indigenous peoples were living in. So less a garden. We tend to think cultivated garden, I think, when we talk about the Garden of Eden. But you're right, this incredibly harmonious whole, right? Where things worked well together. But I think we also get that same kind of vision at the end of the story. Because what we have in the book of Revelation, again and again, is all creatures praising God, right? So like the book of Revelation, after the letters, the letters right at the beginning to the seven churches, then the first thing that happens in chapter 4 is this vision of the four living creatures, one with the face of an ox, the face of an eagle, the face of a lion, and the face of a human being, which are generally thought to represent sort of these parts of creation, right? The eagle representing the birds, the ox, the domestic animals, and the lion, the wild animals, right? And they're praising God along with all the elders before the throne. And what are they praising God for? For you have created all things, and because of you, they have all been created. So there's this, you have all of creation saying, we're praising you, God, because you're the creator, because of this incredible creation that you've made. And then again in chapter 5, it talks about all creatures singing these praises to God. And then I'm going to see how good I am at remembering this. Because chapter 7, again, you have all these multitudes praising God. And then in chapter 9, and then in chapter 12, you have the in chapter 12, you have the earth swallowing up the threat of this river that the dragon sends after the woman. So contrary to most of the Greco-Roman context, earth is portrayed positively there. And then later you have, all living things and the four living creatures that represent all of creation praising God. So that when you get to the end of the book and this New Jerusalem comes down and there's this river coming out of the throne with trees on each side of the river, bearing their fruit every season of the year, the picture that has been built up, it's kind of like the book of Revelation kind of builds up these layers, right? It's not linear in any way. And it kind of keeps circling around judgment and then this basso continuo of the heartbeat of creation's praise to God. All of that, I think, comes together in that last chapter where you actually have a metropolitan that's a food forest. It's full of trees that bear fruit 12 months of the year, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. So creation is actually healing all the sorrow and the pain of the nations, right? So I think we actually end up with, it's an urban vision, but again, it's very much like that food forest at the beginning of the story, which is a way I think that we need to think about. That's why I think, and I'm actually working on this Revelation chapter in the book right now. I really do think that this is a vision of hope for urban renewal that we should be having. So if God's original plan at the beginning of the story was to hang out, by a river in a food forest with all these great creatures, the end of the story, God's still hanging out in a river in a food forest with a whole bunch of creatures that are all singing praise, only they have clothes on now or white robes or something, something like that. Yeah, does that get to the question? Yeah.
I appreciate all your imaginative work around the flood story, and I wanted to ask if you've reflected, as you did, about like in the ark, the animals are giving birth, they're right there. Any reflections on that moment when the waters have receded, they're run aground on Mount Ararat or whatever, they open the door, and, you know, if you've ever lived through a flood, you know, that's
It's-
hardly a pleasant moment.
Yes. It
What
stinks.
what happened then with the grief and the hope?
Yeah, I do talk about that in the chapter. I'm trying to remember what I taught. I mean, it stank, right? This is the end of a flood. It's going to be horrible. Which is interesting because then we actually have scent mentioned next. They build an altar, and it's when God smells the scent, smells the burning of that altar, that God makes this commitment. That is, you know, as long as there's spring and summer, or as long as the earth endures summer and winter, and, you know, will not cease. So it's interesting. I don't know. It's interesting to me, just that, you know, knowing that that's what it would have smelled like, and then having the scent of the sacrifice somehow be the catalyst for God's promise to them. So I'm not sure what to make of all that, how to put that all together, but it is an interesting juxtaposition there. Yeah, but you're right. Not many people think about that. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we tell the story in Sunday school, and it's like, we don't even think about this, and think about this, and think about how stinky that ark was. My goodness. I mean, if you just think about your kids' pets sometimes. Yeah.
One thing that, I don't know, bugs me or just can't wrap my head around is the use of the word regret to describe God, you know, reflecting on the evils of humanity, and like, God, you knew this was going to happen. How can you regret that? So I'm just curious, like, yeah, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, you're putting your finger on our theological assumptions and how they how they shape how we read the story. I mean, we do have all these theological abstractions about who God is and in the story, and those theological abstractions are, yeah, omniscient and omnipotent, all the omnis kind of thing. That's God's going to know everything, but that's not what we get in the story. What we have in the story is a living relationship. So, you know, we have texts like this that say God regretted, God had grief. In Exodus 32, you know, that great story where they've built this golden calf, and, you know, God says to Moses, look what your kids did, you know, look what your people have done. And Moses is like, no, God, they're your people. Nothing to do with these. And God says, I'm gonna wipe them out. And Moses says, you can't do that. Some of you heard me say this earlier today. What will the neighbors think? Which is really what he says. What will the Egyptians think if you wipe them out? And then it says God changed God's mind, right? Okay. We have, and then later on in Jeremiah, you know, God is talking about people offering their children to Moloch, and says, never even occurred to me you would do something like this. Such a thought never crossed my mind. So the way the story is told in the biblical narrative about God isn't a God who knows exactly what's going to happen, but this is a living relationship, and God is in relationship with people in the story and is responding to their disobedience and sometimes their obedience in different kind of ways, and doesn't know what they're going to do. I mean, actually, if you read Richard Middleton's book, Abraham's Silence, you know, he talks about that, and, you know, God is testing Abraham, expecting Abraham might respond differently than he actually does. And then God has to intervene later in the story. See, Richard, this is how I pull your book into everything I do. Just so you know, because it's relevant. We have a much more dynamic picture of who God is throughout that story. Now that's difficult for many of us to handle, because for some people, it's very comforting that God is going to know everything that happens, right? But that's not the picture we get in the text. Maybe the way we could put it is, the way I like to think about it is God is always working for healing and redemption. That's always the outcome that God is working for in this story. Everything from the fall is God working for healing and redemption, for new life, for resurrection in this story. And so we know that that's what God wants for the end of the story, is new life. And God's going to do everything in God's power to make sure that happens. So the minutia in there might change, but there's that foresight about where the story is going that I think we can have trust in God knowing that. And the same goes for kind of God's faithfulness. When the text talks about, the Psalms talk about God being unchanging, they're almost always talking about God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness is unchanging, that working for restoration. So that's very comforting to me, more than, gee, these really crappy things happen and God, well, you knew it was going to happen, so you just let it. It's like, wait, no, there is another force in the world and there is human sin and there is evil. Yeah.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then I have an announcement, and then Dr. Carr will close for us. I'm a little hesitant to ask this, but just as a follow-up to that, we're in a Wesleyan context in which that's a very popular type of answer. But as a biblical instructor like you are, one of the things that we really have to work on is helping students to really let the text say what the text says, not what we want it to say or expected it to say, or even like that it said. And there's a tendency that, we all have to change what the text says to make it what we like it to say. And there is, at the end of Genesis, in the final form of the text, where Joseph's brothers, are talking to Joseph, and Joseph says, you meant it for evil, and God meant it for good.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say God took what you did and used it for good. It says God intended it. And it's an echo, literally, back to Genesis 6, where every intention of the human heart was only evil all the time. And actually, there are a number of textual echoes back to that, which suggests in the text as it is that where humans have been intending evil, God has not just been using it or regretting and working. That's there too, but also that God has been intending it, not just allowing it, but intending it. And so I'm just wondering, that's something that I wrestle with. There is this profound tension in the text, because you have then the Calvinists who say, well, obviously everything was just predetermined. But then you also have the Wesleyans who are, or the more other sorts of interpretations that would be, no, that it's all free will. And there is no intention or sovereignty of God either. And how do you deal with those parts of the text that really do not agree with the idea that God was not sovereign? God really just was purely regretting what he did and that sort of thing.
Well, first of all, thank you for that comment. I would love it if you would email me with those references, because I would like to explore that tension a little bit more. So I wasn't sure if your question was how do I deal with the tensions that suggest that God. So are you kind of asking those texts that say that God did intend it? I mean, you kind of get the same sort of thing in the Exodus narrative, right? Where God's hardening Pharaoh's heart, and quite frankly, I don't know what to do with those. So if you have an idea, I'd love to hear it. It's just, I mean, those are really hard texts to kind of wrestle with, and yeah. So I don't actually have an answer, but I would love to talk more about this to kind of figure out what an answer might be. And we have a few other Old Testament Hebrew Bible profs here who might, have have some insight into that. No.
I do have lots of thoughts about that, but that's not my question tonight. The word that really struck me at the beginning of the lecture was entanglement. And I'm just thinking about, my mortgage and my property value and my retirement and all those things that dictate the way my yard looks more than creation care in this sense. And so and you've made a lot of pretty radical decisions, it sounds like, in regards to this. And these aren't always easy decisions to make, and very difficult for individuals to make, I think. So so all this is leading me towards the idea of like, what role does community play? I didn't hear a lot about community in relation to this, and then from community into the church. Like, then what is the in light of this, in light of the hope, and in light of the things that you're calling us towards, which might actually affect my property value or things like that. Like, what's the role of community in working together and doing this? So
That's in a later chapter of the book. No, I actually serious. When I do present this, I'm always conscious. This is just like a little beginning but community is hugely important. And actually, I don't, when we moved to our farm, we moved there with 4 households, actually. So we moved there with community. And we were very fortunate, actually, to be able to buy an off-grid farm that had been organic for many years. And we're able to make it work that Brian could commute back to Toronto for 3 days and continue his job. And I could continue to do my work kind of from home and teach part-time. So we had certain privileges that most people don't have. Like, if you both need to be working full-time in a city like Toronto, there are some things you can't do. And in an urban environment, it's harder to disentangle from some of those things. So we moved in community, and have had a very strong community around us as well. And that's made a huge difference. So I think the role of community is incredibly important and incredibly difficult, because finding those communities is so hard. Like, I remember when Colossians Remixed came out, and one of our friends did a review at, I think it was CSBS or something. And he said, "This is great. I love this. Where can I sign up? Where can I find a church like this?" He was like, "There are no churches like this around me. I can't find this kind of community." And so I think this is, I think, one of the failures of the church, actually, is that we've put so much emphasis on individual faith, that we haven't put emphasis on creating certain kinds of communities that embody justice, that embody flourishing, that embody our call to care for creation at all. And even now, trying to do that, it's really hard, because this individualism of our culture is so tied in with the individualism that we find in our churches. Nobody wants to share how much, never mind talking about sex in church, nobody wants to talk about money, right? Nobody wants to share how much they actually make, so that they can kind of build community together. And it's incredibly challenging. And we no longer own our farm with 3 other households. We're there. We just own it ourselves now, because community is, as a friend of mine wrote in an article once, she wrote this article called "Community is Bullshit." You can be in community, but somebody's always going to steal your hummus. And community is hard. It's hard work. And we're not practiced at it, right? We don't have that. We haven't flexed those community muscles very well. And you want to know who's really good at community? People who live on the streets, because they've been forced to rely on one another. But those of us who have a little more privilege, hey, we can be self-reliant. So this is a great question. And it's one of the things I'm wrestling with, actually, in this last chapter of the book. The chapter on hope is really, really hard. Grief is easy right now. Yeah.
I think we're going to make that our last question.